Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Gordon Pantala. I am a lawyer from Germany, from Cologne, and I have now seen a video of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. on X, where he also stands up for the Germans, especially regarding the prosecution of Corona, in quotation marks, criminal offenses in Germany. Robert F. Kennedy was already with us in Germany, in Berlin in 2020 at a very large demo where hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets against the extreme and illegal Corona measures that were imposed here by the German government. That is why my big thanks to you that you are standing up not only for the USA, but also for the people in Germany. You can be sure that what you are saying is resonating strongly here, especially now that it is about the prosecution of doctors who also issued medical certificates. The fact that you wrote to the current health minister, Ms. Waken, really makes us very happy. But it is also much worse than you might think in the USA, because it is not just about doctors, it is also about patients who received mask exemptions and were still convicted. It is also about curfews, for example, which were absolutely illegal. That means people were not allowed to go out on the street, especially here in Cologne, where I also handled a case. Yes. So it is worse than you think. It is also about patients who went to their doctor, got a certificate, and were still convicted afterward. I just got a current case from a higher regional court from Sally, where my client was convicted retroactively, so to speak. What you said was, of course, also picked up by the German media, especially by the Bild newspaper. Bild is part of the Springer publishing house, KKR, which are also active in the USA. And it is also very interesting how that is commented on there. Yes, here I'll show you what was made of your video message in the media. Specifically, it is said here that you went after the federal government, so as if you had attacked so aggressively. That is, of course, absolute nonsense, but that is how it is being sold. Furthermore, it is said that you are also allegedly a conspiracy theorist. And Minister Waken, you seem to have misspelled the name. That is also very bad style for this tabloid. That then it is said, yes, you wrote the name wrong. Yes, German names are sometimes complicated. I don't think it is worth mentioning. I just want to say this here to show how the whole story is being framed again. And yes, Waken just claims that your accusations are false, and that this is simply not the case. Waken reacted accordingly to the accusations. The statements of the US health minister lack any basis, are factually false, and must be rejected. I would be happy to explain this to you personally. Her ministry announced in Germany there is freedom of therapy. Criminal prosecution has only occurred in cases of fraud and forgery. For example, when issuing false vaccination passes or fake mask tests. And herein lies the rub, so to speak. That is exactly what is being said here. And as I said, I myself have cases where people are still being prosecuted today. And what the minister is hiding is that the laws here were also changed during the Corona period. So for those who haven't seen the video of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., I'd like to play it for you again briefly so you know what it is all about.
Hi, I'm Robert F. Kennedy Jr., your HHS secretary. Today, I want to tell you about a letter that I just sent to Germany's Federal Minister of Health, Nina Warken, because what's happening in Germany right now demands a clear public response from the United States of America. I've learned that more than 1,000 German physicians and thousands of their patients now face prosecution and punishment for issuing exemptions from wearing masks or getting COVID-19 vaccines during the pandemic. When any government criminalizes doctors for advising their patients, it crosses a line that free societies have always treated as sacred. In my letter, I explain that Germany is targeting physicians who put their patients first and punishing citizens for making their own medical choices. The German government is now violating the sacred patient physician relationship, replacing it with a dangerous system that makes physicians enforcers of state policies. Your health is no longer your doctor's priority under this system. Your doctor instead is serving the welfare of the collective as determined by unelected technocrats with no medical training. Anybody can see the danger in this system. No democracy grounded in confidence and transparency should move in that direction. Patients must always have the freedom to make personal medical decisions without coercion or political pressure. That principle forms the bedrock of every democratic nation. But the reports coming out of Germany show a government sidelining patient autonomy and limiting people's abilities to act on their own convictions when they face medical decisions. During the COVID era, governments across the world expanded their authority. Even in America, doctors were unjustly attacked for challenging the status quo. Germany followed that same pattern, and now doctors who raise questions or challenged official directives face conviction, the loss of their licenses, and even exile from their professions. Many of these physicians took personal and professional risks because they believed that their duty to their patients required it. They stood by their Hippocratic oath at a moment when the government institutions demanded strict conformity with state diktats. Actions like these erode public trust. They weaken the credibility of medical institutions and legal systems meant to protect the public. When decisions arise out of fear rather than open dialogue, societies pay the price long afterward. And that's why I urge the German government to change course, to end these prosecutions, to restore unjustly revoked licenses, to stop punishing doctors who acted in good faith and served their patients with integrity, and to let the German people make their own informed medical decisions. Germany has long held a respected place in the global community as a nation committed to democratic values and human rights. Policies that suppress dissent, that silence speech, that criminalize medical decision making undermine that legacy. A confident government listens to its citizens. A free society protects the rights to think, the right to question, and the right to choose. In my letter, I made it clear that Germany has the opportunity and the responsibility to correct this trajectory, to restore medical autonomy, to end politically motivated prosecutions, and to uphold the rights that anchor every democratic nation. History will record how leaders respond at moments like this. Thank you.
Produced by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services.
The German health minister, Ms. Waken, claims here that what you are claiming is false because only the people who had committed document forgery offenses would have been in court. What she is concealing, however, is that the regulation here was changed during the corona period. It used to be that presenting a certificate was only a criminal offense if it was done to an authority. It was then introduced that this also applies if you present it to an employer and the certificate is false. The question is, what is a false certificate anyway, right? That is the next question. When is the certificate actually false? So, and that is the crucial question here. I just had a trial, as I just mentioned, with my client Sylvia Maria in Hanover. She had a corresponding certificate issued by two doctors. The first certificate contained nothing at all about her health situation because this certificate was, for example, only valid at the demonstration to be presented to the US public order authorities. Of course, it doesn't have to state what illnesses she suffers from, because her health situation is simply none of a police officer's or public order official's business. Then, in the second step, she had the details written into a certificate for a trial in the labor court because she didn't want to, or rather couldn't, wear the mask at work for psychological reasons. Both doctors confirmed this for her, and in the trial that we had in Hanover, it was then claimed, no, these two doctors are wrong. You see, they had appointed an expert, a Professor Barlow, who subsequently only saw the files and came to a different conclusion. And he said that the certificate should not have been issued because the doctor has to weigh the interest. That is what you mentioned with the keyword, the common good. The doctor has to weigh the common good against the individuals. No, of course, he doesn't have to. So the common good, we already know that in Germany, and that was under the Nazi regime, yes, where the individual counts for nothing, but only the community, the so-called back then it was called the healthy national body. Yes, and all people who refer to these comparisons are also prosecuted in Germany, told it is a trivialization of the Holocaust and are brought to court for it. Of course, it comes to mind to say that what happened back then must never happen again in Germany. This means that it is not a trivialization, but rather these people want to draw attention to the fact that these authoritarian measures are absolutely unlawful, and they have no intention of trivializing anything, but they are still put on trial. The fact is, we have various different opinions here. The doctor who assessed my client, or rather even two doctors said, no, she doesn't need to wear a mask, also for psychological reasons. Then the court calls an expert witness who retroactively claims the opposite and has never spoken to the client, never spoken to her. Nevertheless, I lose the case. You have to imagine that I lose the case because the court that reviewed it, the higher court said, well, the court is free in its assessment of evidence. They could do, so to speak, whatever they wanted, right? But here we are exactly at the point you mentioned, public health and the rights of the individual. And in a democracy, it should not be the case that the rights of the individual have to be subordinated to the general public. And then let's think again, how dangerous was this coronavirus anyway? Yes, that is the next question. If it had been as dangerous as Ebola or something like that, you could perhaps even understand that. But the fact is that the mortality, the death rate was under 1% of the population. So, and in my opinion, you can no longer claim that. And that brings us to the topic of ethics and morals. In Germany, we had a so-called ethics council chaired by Alina Beef, and she appealed to people to all get vaccinated. That is a moral obligation, but has nothing to do with ethics. A complete miscasting. But of course, politicians then make use of such experts because they can then say, the expert said so. It doesn't come from us, the expert said so. Yes. So let's summarize what Ms. Waken has claimed here, that her claims are false is of course not true, but the laws were tightened and the law was also introduced in Germany that every employee who comes to the workplace and is unvaccinated must get tested every day. This, of course, put pressure on people to get vaccinated. That was also said, we have to put pressure on these people. They all have to get vaccinated. So, and that is why what you said is, of course, absolutely right. And what Ms. Waken said is absolutely wrong. Of course, it is also a consequence of politics, namely of the legislation that was made here, namely this obligation to test, which was of course intended to put pressure on people to get vaccinated. And this with the knowledge, and now it comes that the vaccination or the so-called vaccination, I'll get to that in a moment, does not protect at all against the virus being transmitted further. That was always the claim here. That was the main claim to be able to justify these measures at all. In fact, however, it is the case that the vaccination, and this was later admitted by Pfizer or the German company BioNTech, does not protect others, but at most oneself. At the beginning, it was even claimed that it was highly effective, and later you had to get revaccinated, reboosted, because it obviously didn't help, because as everyone knows, a virus is constantly changing and therefore cannot be contained at all with such a vaccination, genetic engineering treatment. I'll get to that. So complete nonsense. And these people know that too. These people know that too. Let's now return to the accusations that Mr. Kennedy made regarding the German federal government. And of course, it is true, and he is absolutely right. Yes, because many doctors who issued certificates here have either fled abroad or they have also been convicted. They have also ended up in jail. They all had one thing in common, that all doctors who still issued certificates at all, who dared to issue certificates at all, they were searched. Yes, there was a house search, and then they tried to find some arguments why these people should be put in jail. Yes. For example, Dr. Bodo Schiffman should be mentioned here, who no longer lives in Germany, but in Tanzania. And others too, a doctor I represented in Cologne was searched. And that was, of course, a signal to the other doctors. Don't you dare issue any certificates, exceptions, and you see what happens. You will be searched and you will end up in jail. And that is exactly what Robert F. Kennedy Jr. said here, that one should stop persecuting these people. And that is not being done to this day. Yes, but they also haven't stopped persecuting the patients who then have a corresponding. I just told you that my client, Sylvia Maria, she had a certificate issued. She believed in the certificate. She went to the doctor. She described what problem she has, and the doctor said, yes, you'll get a certificate from me. In the trial, an expert witness who has never seen the woman comes and says that for the good of the general public, such a certificate should never be issued. And that is why my client was then convicted. You really have to think about that. I also have a case here from Cologne. There was a corresponding rule that at a shop, you are only allowed to consume the food you buy there at a distance of 100 m or something like that. Allowed to eat, yes. And my client had bought a fish sandwich, but then did not adhere to this distance rule because, well, she was not 100 m away from the snack bar, and was then convicted because she had already taken a bite of a fish sandwich. You just have to think about that. That is why she was actually convicted. But I can also tell you from practice that the judges no longer adhered to the law. For example, the following, it was about distance rules. So, and the question was, were they followed? And as proof that in this case it was followed, I invited the spouse and wanted to have the spouse questioned in court. Who could have testified that the distancing rules had been followed? But the judge didn't want to hear the spouse at all. He claimed that according to the rules of procedure, this was not possible, which is absolutely false. According to the rules of procedure, a spouse can refuse to testify, but you are still free to make the stay statement if you want. This means that procedural rules were simply no longer being followed in Germany. And that is still the case today. That is still the case today. So then it came to the point that in Germany, I think it was the same in the USA, at least in the healthcare system, there was a requirement to get vaccinated. Vaccination, alleged vaccination, because it is not a vaccination, not a classic vaccination, but a gene therapy. So whoever didn't want to do that was just not allowed to work anymore. That was also decided by our highest court in Germany, by a judge who went to dinner with the chancellor in the evening. Just imagine that the man was never a judge before. He was a lawyer, gets the highest office, goes to dinner with the head of state, and then make such decisions. And how did he justify that? That the vaccine mandate, at least as far as the military is concerned, or also the healthcare system, that this would be important because of this transmission, which didn't even exist. Right? It is even extremely dangerous. You have to imagine someone who is vaccinated can still vaccinated. I say now in quotation marks, infect other people, they can. Then a testing requirement would have been even more important or better, but no, everyone had to get vaccinated, otherwise they lost their jobs. Right? This is extreme pressure that was applied here, and that cannot be justified except with the narrative that the so-called vaccination could have prevented transmission. And now comes the Minister of Health who was at the helm at the time, so not Ms. Walken, but back then, and that is Mr. Spahn. And he says in all seriousness that he would have known that this is the case, that the vaccination cannot prevent transmission. So that was exactly the narrative on which all these laws were built. That means the man knows it, but does it anyway. Or rather, it wasn't him, but the subsequent Minister of Health named Karl Lauterbach. He then introduced that these regulations in the law, but with Mr. Spahn. I have to tell you the following. As a corona law, he had already intended to enact another law right at the beginning of the pandemic in 2020, in which a distinction was to be made between vaccinated and unvaccinated people, right? There was no vaccine at all yet. He already wanted to make that distinction. Then, and I said that is not on, that is a vaccine mandate, or at least an indirect one. And you have to imagine, because of that statement, I, as a lawyer, got into trouble with the Bar Association because they told me I wasn't allowed to say something like that. I wasn't allowed to claim such a thing. In the subsequent instance, I was acquitted, so to speak. And it was then said that, of course, he is allowed to express his legal opinion. But first came an indictment. That means extreme pressure was also put on lawyers who were critical, like myself and others, to just keep their mouths shut. That is the situation in Germany, dear Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And you are absolutely right about what you said.